Okay, now we're going to start. We're going to shift from the Gospel of John to the Gospel of Luke. And the journey to Jerusalem. Now, this occupies 10 chapters in the Gospel of Luke. Fortunately, we are not going to be dealing with all 10 chapters. We're going to take a few incidents here. We'll start out by discussing the major themes, um, and then we'll talk about the Good Samaritan, Jesus and the Pharisees, and the rich man and Lazarus. Let's look at the major themes. Um, Here's an overview of the journey. Now, this is a grand campaign, well organized. At this point in the story, Jesus is still an up-country preacher. He's a Galilean, which at the time, that's kind of like saying he's a hillbilly. He's a country person. He's not sophisticated like those city slickers in Jerusalem. Okay? Well, he's an irritant to the authorities, but he's not a real threat. Well, Jesus organizes his grand movement into Jerusalem. He sends out 72 disciples to preach to all the towns along the way and to gather the countryside before making his grand entrance into Jerusalem. Now, his message is very, very particular. So he comes to Jerusalem with a large following. In the Gospel of Luke, there are about 30 parables or incidents taught along the way. And so this is the heart of the teaching in Luke. So the major themes are the need for faith and the need for repentance. And those two go together. There's not one without the other. The dangers of wealth, that's a constant theme in the Gospel of Luke. And the great commandment, love one another as I have loved you. But this love is always something that's in action. Another theme is the hypocrisy of the religious authorities. Well, that's a theme that never goes away, isn't it? And finally, this is a universal religion that transcends ethnic and cultural boundaries. Now, along the way, he will 3 times make a prediction of his passion and death. Then he took the 12 aside and said to them, Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and everything written by the prophets about the Son of Man will be fulfilled. He will be handed over to the Gentiles, and he will be mocked and insulted and spat upon, and after they have scourged him, they will kill him. But on the 3rd day he will rise. But they understood nothing of this. The word remained hidden from them, and they failed to comprehend what he said. Well, he repeats this 3 times. And they cannot understand. And you can understand why they don't understand. I'm going to die and rise. I'm gathering up this big movement and going to Jerusalem, and they're going to kill me. None of it makes sense. And remember, the disciples, the apostles, are still thinking in terms of forming a government, and they argue about who's going to be the greatest. In other words, who's going to be the chancellor and who's going to be the secretary of defense, etc. That's how they're thinking. All right. So let's look at the Good Samaritan. Now, this deals, the occasion for this is a lawyer who's trying to trap Jesus. And he asks him, what is the great commandment? And this leads to the great question. So look at Luke 25 to 28. The lawyer is asking a standard question to test Jesus. What is the greatest commandment? Okay, Jesus gets it right, all right? Love your neighbor, love your neighbor as yourself, and love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus gets it right, but the lawyer won't relent. You know how lawyers are. So he asks the great question, who is my neighbor? And here, you see, he intends to trap Jesus. Because for a lawyer, this answer would have gone on and on. And in the Talmud, you'd have to cite all sorts of passages in the Talmud to find out who is your neighbor. You know, is the person in the same village or the next village, or the village to 3 villages over? Does that count as your neighbor? No. Jesus won't fall into that trap. Uh, he has another answer, and that answer is a story. So Luke 10:29 to 37, and I think we all know the story of the Good Samaritan. But you have to understand, the whole idea of a Good Samaritan was repulsive to the Jews. The Samaritans were bad people, period. The Samaritans practiced an older form of Judaism, which they considered heretical. So the Samaritans practiced a pre-exilic Judaism, which was very, very different from the Judaism that they brought back from Babylon. Well, in the story, the priest and the Levite, the religious people, pass by this suffering man, and they look the other way. They just go on their way. Only the Samaritan helps. So Jesus' answer breaks all tribal and religious boundaries. Now the lawyer has no choice but to agree, which wasn't his intention. Well, who is my neighbor? We have to ask the same question. We have the same problem. Do we treat people differently based on their tribe, their looks, their status, their political opinions? Neighbor today is based on an accident of birth or location. The person in the house next to me is my neighbor. Um, the person who shares my background is my neighbor. But now Jesus makes neighbor a choice. We choose whom to treat as a neighbor. We create the neighbor by responding to their needs. Okay, denouncing the Pharisees. This is a big deal. The Pharisees considered themselves the most religious people. Okay? They were strict about the law. They were faithful in all their religious duties. Well, Jesus omits a ritual washing before meals. This offends them tremendously. And he says, he notes that they observe all the rules, but they engage in plunder. Rule washing, he says, is giving alms. And he mentions the tithes of mint and rue. Now this tells you how trivial, how silly the rules are. So you pick mint from your garden to season a dish. Well, you have to pick one. If you pick 10 leaves, you have to have one for the temple. So they are big on outer observances, but they miss the inner realities. The, the lawyers we have with us always. Okay. With the lawyers, his language is even more extreme. He says they impose burdens on the people that they do not share. Jesus charges them with the blood of all the prophets. But note, the charges that Jesus is making against the religious people of his day are identical to the charges made by all the great prophets, by Isaiah, by Amos, by Micah, by Hosea, by Jeremiah. This is the same thing. This is the same argument, the same quarrel. And I think that argument goes on today. Now, the lawyers and the Pharisees are more determined to trap Jesus into saying something they can use against him. And that will be a big part of the story. Let's think about rules and reality. Rules can help us navigate reality. I mean, we don't want to have to make big decisions about every little thing during the day. Rules help us. But they can also become a substitute for reality. So, have there been situations in your life when rules got in the way of doing good? Or have you ever followed the rules only to find out that they did actual harm? All right, let's move on to the rich man and Lazarus. Starts with making a contrast between these two. There was a rich man who dressed in purple garments. Purple was the royal color. You had to be very, very rich to wear purple. There was a rich man who dressed in purple garments and fine linen and dined sumptuously each day. And lying at his door was a poor man named Lazarus, covered with swords, who would gladly have eaten his fill of the scraps that fell from the rich man's table. Dogs even used to come and lick his sores. So Lazarus desires only scraps from the table, nothing that would in the least inconvenience the rich man. There is no indication that the rich man broke any of the ritual laws. He's not being charged with that. He violates only the law of charity. Now there's a reversal. Luke loves these reversals. You'll see them throughout his gospel. Okay? This is one of the few descriptions of hell in the gospels. And it's always given, these descriptions are always given in connection with the failure of charity towards the poor. The two are connected, lack of charity and hell. There's an insistence on listening to the prophets, and they must be moved by faith alone. So the rich man ends up suffering in hell. Lazarus ends up in the bosom of Abraham. So we're moved by faith alone and moved to love of neighbor. And that's how you tell if you have faith. If you love your neighbor, then you can say you have faith. But if you don't, well, the faith is just for show. So the Great Commandment. These three episodes have one theme. Living the Great Commandment. Love God and love neighbor. But moreover, love God by loving your neighbor. And if you can't do the latter, you haven't done the former. Your neighbor is the image of God. So the law, this is not to speak against the law, but to remember that it is a guidepost, not an end post, not an end point. All right. So we've dealt today with the Eucharist that is at the heart of Jesus' mission, and we've dealt with the Good Samaritan the rich man of Lazarus, and the rejection of this rather narrow religious tradition uh, in which this story occurs. All right. Uh, Thank you for listening to this. And if any of you are in the Irving area, Dallas area, please feel free to come to our discussions on these topics every Tuesday night. Thank you for your attention.